The scripture lesson for this morning comes from the Gospel according to St. Mark, starting with chapter 8, verse 27, and going all the way through verse 38. Now, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" So they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." And Jesus asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all of this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who want to lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world but forfeit their lives? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. So we have another sort of casual service this morning. We have a lot of folks out at Fallisburg helping out, manning the tables there, selling food, raising awareness about the church. We were out there yesterday. The turnout was great. We had so many people. The line for food was forming out into the lawn. I mean, it just kept stretching, which was a very cool thing. And so we are thankful that those people are not with us this morning because they are serving the congregation in a different capacity. We're thankful they're able to do that, and they're willing to make the sacrifice of missing a service, although in their case, not listening to my sermon might not be such a sacrifice, so I don't want to speak for them. Having said that, we are thankful for all the work that they do. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about what we call A People's History of Christianity. It's a book by Diana Butler Bass that outlines kind of an overview of what the Christian church has been like historically and how we got to the point we are today. One of the things that I mention every week is that you don't have to have been here for those earlier sermons to play catch up, to follow along. There is a narrative, there's a story that we're telling here every week, but I try to play catch up myself so that you don't have to do that work. So if you haven't been here and you feel like you're missing something, don't panic. So over the last couple weeks, we've mentioned the church in two different ways. The first, 500 years or so of Christian history, we mentioned that the church was very small groups of cells, just people dedicated to this strange Jesus fellow. Different beliefs about Jesus circulated at the time. Not everybody was in agreement about who Jesus was. But there were lots of different people who, in very different ways, responded to the teaching of Jesus, said, "Hey, this guy's onto something," and then began to organize their own lives around the teachings of this Jesus fellow. Add to that, then, after the first 500 years, that the church has grown into an institution of its own. Last week, we looked at the medieval church, at about 1,000 years or so of church history that was all about institutionalizing Christian tradition. So at the beginning of the Christian church, when we said church, we meant people. But in medieval times, we begin to think of the church not as just people, but as the instrument used to preserve the traditions that the people were expected to follow. So the church is no longer just people. The church is now buildings, institutions, organizations, canon lawyers, all of that stuff. Which brings us then to the Reformation. 500 years ago, a guy named Martin Luther nails a document to the door of a church and changes the world forever. At least that's how the story goes. The Catholic Church is deeply corrupt. The roots of the medieval church have continued to settle in, and now the church is deeply entrenched in a position of power. And so the story goes that this guy, this German priest named Martin Luther, who took issue with some of the church's policies, says, I can't take it anymore. And so he nails his 95 theses, his 95 points about the church's failures, to the door of a church and says, let the games begin. And that leads to this essentially outright war between Protestants and Catholics that has led to tensions for the last 500 years between us and them. But there are some important things we need to understand about Martin Luther. The first is that Martin Luther, although he did some good things and some heroic things, and his legacy is important, he was kind of a schmuck. This is an important detail that you need to know. Martin Luther had a very nasty habit of thinking he was the only one who had ever come to an idea. So here's an example. There are a lot of men in this room. I'm sure none of us can relate to that. That feeling of being the only one who feels like you've ever come to a conclusion, right? Why don't you just ask for directions? Oh, I know the way. It'll be fine. So Martin Luther says, the reason why the whole world isn't Christian is because the Catholic Church has just become so darn corrupt that everybody just sees the Catholic Church and they see the corruption and they just say, this is untenable, these people are hypocrites, and they don't want to convert to Christianity anymore. So Martin Luther says, we're going to do something about that. We're going to lead a counter effort to fix the church from the inside, resolve those tensions, and hypothetically make the world a better place. Is there anyone here who would argue with that? On the surface, that sounds really good. The problem is, Luther tended to think of himself as the only person who could fix the problem. So later in his life, after the Reformation got started, and we'll talk about what that entailed, but I just want to skip ahead and say, really after all those years, as he was looking back on his own life, he ended his life with a lot of bitterness because the Reformation didn't do what he wanted it to. So I want to start with that. We're talking about something called the Protestant Reformation. You and I are sitting here because it happened, and yet the guy who really started the whole thing wasn't entirely happy with the results, didn't feel like he exactly got what he wanted out of the bargain, and got a little bitter in his later years. Particularly when he noticed that even after the Reformation, people still weren't converting at the rates that he wanted them to. The Jews are a great example. I always bring up Judaism because that's my sort of connection, right? Those are my roots into this history. But the curious thing is that Martin Luther was actually very sympathetic to Jews when he was younger. He was very sympathetic to Jews. He liked Jews quite a bit. He was very sympathetic to them because he felt that the Catholic Church had mistreated them. Fast forward to being the father of the Reformation, Martin Luther doesn't like Jews so much. He writes at least 2 documents in which he excoriates the Jews for not converting to Christianity. Why did he suddenly change? Because they turned him down. So it was fine that they turned the Catholic Church down. He understood that. But he kind of assumed that, well, if this Reformation happens and the church really gets its act together, that's going to cause everybody to finally jump on the bandwagon. That's really all it's going to take for everybody to become a Christian. The whole world is just going to be transformed. So he goes to the Jews and he says, we know you had all these problems with Catholicism, but we fixed it. We had to leave the church to do it, but we fixed it. Now, how about being Protestants? Got this new bridge to sell you called Protestantism. And the Jews say, no, we're not interested. Looks too much like the old stuff, we're good. And so Martin Luther's tone suddenly changes. So instead of being victims of Catholicism, now the Jews become dangerous themselves. So we need to understand a little bit about how Luther's mind works, right? He's very much convinced that if people just listen to him, then everything is going to be resolved. And when that doesn't happen, he responds with some bitterness and some hatred and some rhetoric that we don't like. That's the central focus of the Protestant Reformation. The idea that resistance is not only possible, but sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes, As the story of Jesus tells us, things need to die in order to be reborn. The whole story of Jesus is this idea that sometimes the system doesn't work anymore, and you need somebody to come along and say, what are we doing? What's the point of all this if people are still suffering? So we need that. But it doesn't fix everything. And this is the important factor. Reforming something, changing something, doesn't make it better once and for all. 500 years after the shadow of the Protestant Reformation, the church is really kind of facing a new crisis. If you look at statistics, membership is declining. Engagement across all denominations is declining for the most part. Pentecostals are the exception, so my family will be set. I don't know that I will, but they will be fine. The numbers are actually not, and I don't say this to be depressing, I just want to be honest, the numbers are not very encouraging for the future of church growth worldwide. We don't think that all churches are going to go away. We're not despairing. We're just saying that the church is not as powerful as it used to be. We're in need of a new reformation, in the sense that we need to look at what's been working, keep it, and then get rid of the rest of it. And be willing to do that, not only as something that's good to do every now and again, but as something that our faith actually calls us to do. And that brings us to the scripture lesson this morning. So Jesus is trying to build a movement, and seemingly his disciples understand that. Because Peter takes Jesus aside and tries to tell him, hey, some of the stuff you're saying might actually be hurting us and not helping us. You're talking about how the people don't like you. You're talking about how you're going to get crucified. You're saying all of these things that seem kind of negative, but the reality is the movement is growing. Maybe you should tone it down a little. We're doing okay right now. Chill out. Enjoy the moment. Let it be what it is. And Jesus rebukes him and says, no, we have to always be on our guard. We have to always be mindful of what we're doing. We can't get complacent. We can't get lazy. We have to tell people the truth at all times, even if it's inconvenient, even if sometimes that means our membership goes down. One of the things the UCC has to address quite frequently is when churches become what we call open and affirming. We're an open and affirming church, so that means that we have a policy on the books that lets us be inclusive to all people, regardless of lots of the things that people use to discriminate against, right? Race, culture, gender, sexual orientation, any of that stuff. Anything that an HR department might be upset about if someone were being discriminated against, we feel like that's a good baseline for this church in terms of our policy. If an HR department is going to get nervous about the rhetoric being used, we probably don't want to use it in this church. That's our policy. And a lot of UCC churches have developed that policy, right? We have a denominational headquarters that's job is to help us develop that policy. I was having a conversation with a church that's going through the process, and they were asking me for advice based on my experience working in open and affirming congregations. One of the things they asked was, did anybody leave? Now, I wasn't involved in either of the two O&A processes for the UCC in either of the churches that I serve. I sort of came in the aftermath. But I knew enough to know that some people left over being inclusive, that taking a stand, that changing the church's policy, reforming the church's policy in some way, meant some people were just not going to stay. And you have to accept that that's an inevitability. And that's true probably with anything. Even if you change something as small as the music, right? For some people, that's a big thing. And if they don't like it, they don't want to stay. So you internalize that and you say, okay, that's an inevitability. Do we not be open and affirming because we're afraid of alienating some people? Do we not take a stand on things that matter to us because, we don't want to drive people away, because we're having a Peter moment where we're like, hey, maybe we should tone it down so people don't get alienated, so people don't feel like they're not, welcome here. But Jesus says what we stand for is just as important as the fact that we stand. So yeah, it matters that you stand for something, but the content really is kind of important. It matters, right? One of the things that we realize with certain political beliefs is that it's okay to be different than I am politically, but some political beliefs do not translate well into healthy actions. Looking at the political situation in Germany in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, leading to World War II, there were lots of factors that contributed to what essentially became Nazi Germany, and that took time. It didn't happen overnight. Conditions had to be developed. Ideas about the world had to be accepted in order for people to be comfortable doing some of the things that they did. So our ideas matter, and that's what Jesus is saying to Peter. He's like, no, listen, don't tell me to tone it down. Just because it's not safe to reform right now, we need to be bold. We need to be courageous. We need to be firm in our convictions and not wishy-washy. Which brings us to us today. So Lindsay's back at school. As you'll know, she isn't with me this morning. Synagogue school, Hebrew school just started back up again this morning. It's their first day. She's very excited. We were up last night going over notes of her lessons and talking. And that conversation got me thinking about the sermon this morning, and I want to end on this note. So as you'll know, my wife is Jewish. I think most of you know that. We interfaith family. And we were married in the synagogue that she teaches, and we've been connected there for many years. It's a Reformed synagogue, even though we don't necessarily identify as Reformed Jews. My wife doesn't necessarily see herself as a denominational type. The community we're a part of is Reform. And I was having a conversation with the rabbi once, and I said, what's the difference between Reform, as in Reformed Judaism, and Reformed, as in Christianity, like the Christian Reformed Church versus Reformed Judaism? Because they both use the word, and we had a Reformation 500 years ago, so where did you get that word, and why do you use it? And he was testy about this idea of Reformed. He says, we're not Reformed Jews, we're Reformed Jews. Why is that so important to you? Get this. And this is what he said. He didn't miss a beat, so I know he had thought about it before. He says, well, when you are reformed, you've done the work. The work is behind you, hypothetically. When you are reformed, it's in the past tense. You took something old, you made it new again, and now you're done. If you are reform, or reforming, then you just keep changing. Maybe not all the time, not every day. You don't want to be too unstable. But you're recognizing that change is something you'll always have to do. Sometimes big changes, sometimes teeny tiny changes. Sometimes it's as simple as, well, do we start worship at 9:30 or 10? Other times it's bigger. Are we going to be open and affirming or not? But whatever the reason, we each come to this place, hopefully trying to make a difference. And so we don't stop at one change, one time, and then pat ourselves on the back and say, we did it, we don't have any more work to do. For example, being open and affirming. We're open and affirming, we don't have any more work to do. We don't have to be inviting, we don't have to be inclusive, we don't have to be good greeters at the door. We don't have to do anything now because we're open and affirming. Nobody in this room would say that. I know you well enough to say, nobody in this room would say, well, we did it, we're done, let's not think about anything anymore. So I encourage you to remember the words of this rabbi friend of mine. In light of the Reformation and its history, and again, we're 500 years, that's a good round number. More changes are coming down the pipeline for the church, but I encourage you, rather than seeing yourself as reformed, as having done it once and for all and never having to do it again, keep learning, keep growing, keep reforming. Allow yourself the bravery and the courage to change. Don't be like Martin Luther and assume that changing the whole world rests on you, and if you don't do it, no one can. But like Martin Luther, and like Jesus, be willing to change, to reform, not to just be reformed. Amen.